Well, good morning, and welcome to the plenary session. And let me also add my welcome our web audience who are also tuned in here. My name is Peter Robertson, and I'm chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. And amongst other things, I'm in the enviable position of being able to take credit for the great work that's done by Jane Wills and her remarkable team. But this morning, you have the opportunity to hear Dr. Maura O'Neill deliver a special address, and I have the privilege of introducing her. After Dr. O'Neill has spoken, we'll sit down here and take some questions from the audience, so be thinking about your questions. Maura O'Neill is the Senior Counselor to the Administrator and Chief Innovation Officer at the U.S. Agency for International Development, the USAID. In the public, private, and academic sectors, Dr. O'Neill has focused on creating entrepreneurial solutions and public policy solutions for some of the toughest problems in the fields of energy, education, infrastructure, financing, and business development. So with no further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. O'Neill.
It was a few minutes before 2 in the morning on January 19th, 1971. I lived about 35 miles from here, and despite the fact that even when I was growing up, I was a night owl, I, like most of the Bay Area, was fast asleep. As you can see, it was an enormously foggy evening, and I love the fog in the Bay Area. I think it's magical. I think it spurs our imagination. I think of castles long before Harry Potter was around. But if you're a boater, it's a very treacherous time because you don't necessarily know what's going to emerge out from under that fog when it's too late. That night, there was an oil tanker crossing under the San Francisco Bay Bridge. It was on its way to Richmond, which is just up the road a bit, and it was going to offload a full tank of black gold, as we call it. Oil has really changed the economic face of America. It has fueled our innovations in material science, in industrial production, and in transportation. It has allowed us also to power our boats and our planes to get our troops across the Atlantic to stop the tyranny of Hitler and Stalin. Oil has really provided great feedstock for our prosperity. But that wasn't the only boat on the San Francisco Bay that night. There was actually another tanker who was also traveling to and from Richmond. Despite Loran, despite radar, despite a captain that was on the bridge looking out, having his hands on the controls, trying to figure out what was going on, all of a sudden, bang! The boats hit each other, alarms went off, ripped open 6 compartments of the full ship, and thousands of gallons started flowing out into the bay. By the morning, there were 800,000 gallons, the largest oil spill the San Francisco Bay had ever seen. Half of those went out to the Pacific Ocean, and half of them went down the bay. It sullied many of the rocks and many of our gorgeous beaches around the Bay Area. And it also soiled thousands of birds who called the San Francisco Bay Area their winter home as well. I don't know if it made the national news, but it certainly made the local news and was plastered all over the TVs. Whether you were one of the half of Americans who owned a color TV, or whether you saw it on a black and white, the images were dramatic. The telephone lines were jammed in the Bay Area with thousands of people trying to staff bird washing stations around the Bay Area. For birds that had gotten fouled by that, they stopped thermal regulating, and they ultimately die fairly quickly if they aren't able to get that stuff off. It was at that moment, I couldn't go to those, I wasn't old enough to drive, I didn't have an access to a car. But it was at that moment that I thought, there is tremendous innovation that has happened in fueling businesses and profits, both here in the Bay Area and around the world. But perhaps it was possible to think about having that kind of economic prosperity, having that kind of innovation, and also thinking about stepping more lightly on the earth or crafting solutions that reached more broadly into the world. And that is the moment that I decided to devote my life to what is now known as a social entrepreneur. I am here today, and I share that personal story with you because you and I and the people at USAID share a very important piece of DNA. We share a piece of DNA that says that this world is important enough to give a damn, and that we're going to devote our lives to that. I believe, as you do, that we can make a difference, that we can desperately seek ways in which your entrepreneurial skills, your ideas, your drive, and yes, your fearlessness can make for a better world. I'm here today to celebrate the hard, pioneering work that Global Philanthropy Forum has done over the last decade, and you as individuals, as families, as corporate philanthropists, and as foundations have done to craft and implement solutions that save people's lives, that give people more opportunities, and create for a better day. I'm also here today to celebrate partnerships. And we believe that we do not have a monopoly on great ideas, that they do in fact come from all sorts of places. So I'll tell you about a few partnerships of people in this room that we're proud to call our partners in this quest. One of them we just did in the last 6 months. You had a chance to hear Ben Affleck from the Eastern Congo Initiative yesterday. We did a partnership with them, and I'll tell you why we did that partnership and why that's part of the reform and new modernizing of USAID. We know that in the near term, we're not going to see democracy and governance improvements in the Eastern Congo. We just can't click our fingers and hope for a different kind of governance where people show up and provide justice to women who have been violated or find health services for kids and families who need it. And so what Ben and Whitney Williams and Lauren Powell-Jobs and Pam Amidiar and the founders of Eastern Congo did is they said, we're about creating the local capacity in the Eastern Congo, despite the fact that there isn't a functioning government, to provide this kind of infrastructure and do that. Under Administrator Shaw and President Obama and Secretary Clinton, in the first policy directive in development in 50 years, they said, imagine the conditions where AID is no longer necessary, and go create that. And we believe the Eastern Congo Initiative is an example of the kinds of partnerships that we are excited to be part of because they are building the kind of local infrastructure that is necessary to imagine the time in which we are no longer necessary. We're also excited about the relationship that we forged with the Rockefeller Foundation, both on the Global Broadband Initiative and on impact investing. As Peter said, I spent most of my life in the electricity industry, and we are proud as Americans that when we laid out the electricity grids in the US, it wasn't very profitable to go to farms and in rural areas. And so we as a nation said, we don't want to leave those people behind. And we passed a law on rural electrification, we provided low-cost financing, and we brought that kind of miracle opportunity to people throughout the US. The Global Broadband Initiative is an example of that, of saying, yes, there's 5 billion mobile phones, but there's still a lot of the world that doesn't have access, for which there's not a profitable business model, and how can we partner to do that? And lastly, a partnership that we did over the last year was after Haiti. My first day in the job was, full-time job, was the Haiti earthquake. It was quite an interesting first day that sort of went on for a month. I had the privilege of having breakfast with Annie Maxwell, who was a White House fellow, and the White House sent us over some reinforcements within about 48 hours or 72 hours to do that. But what we knew about Haiti is, yes, in fact, it was challenged before the earthquake. The international community was feeding 1 out of every 4 Haitians, even before the earthquake happened. And yet we saw the commercial infrastructure of the country completely destroyed, and we saw 1/3 of all the people in that country affected by the earthquake. And we said, how can we partner with somebody to put in place a transformational legacy commitment that would really change Haiti? And we did that with the Gates Foundation and having a challenge grant around mobile money. I tell you this as examples because part of what I want to do here is to encourage you to become partners with us. We are in 79 countries, and we need your new ideas, your fresh perspectives, because we, as I said, don't believe that, new ideas just come from us. So let me tell you a few things that we've learned about development. If USAID is going to be a modern development enterprise, we have to be on the constant hunt for partners just like yourself who bring other perspectives, knowledge, ideas, and assets. So I'll tell you about 3 things that we've learned, because we are about focus, impact, and scale. We're not just about development, we're about changing the world, as I know you are. So the first thing we've learned is that it starts with deep listening. That one of the statistics I read the other day is that many women would rather spend money on cell phones and cosmetics than clean water. And so we ought not to believe that we know exactly what they want and where the profitable business models are. So before you shake your head and say, well, that's ridiculous, I would ask you, what child do you know or what neighbor do you know who bought a fancy car, who took a fancy vacation, rather than investing in education or providing a financial safety net? We are all aspirational, and we ought not to apologize or be judgmental about that, but we ought to understand what the aspirations of the communities we live in. The second thing is, it only matters if we scale. I told you that you and I share this DNA about believing the world is important enough to give a damn. But some of us share a disease, and we have it at USAID, and that's called pilotitis. And that is that we fundamentally believe that we have to have something for a village, etc., but we don't think, how do we think like Howard Schultz and not just open a cool coffee house, but imagine 11 or 22,000 coffee houses around the world that have their own sort of flavor. So this is an idea of scale. So this looks like a great toy and recreation for kids. My sister has an autistic child, and it turns out that this is actually neurologically really, really valuable for kids in reorganizing their brain. Only because of liability laws in the US, we've mostly banned them. So this looks like the kids are having fun. This is actually a water pump. And there was no electricity in this town, so they were trying to figure out how it is that we get this pump. This was very, very clever. So these kids play on this all day, and the community has clean water as a result. A fabulous, innovative idea, only it doesn't scale. Because you can't sort of stamp these out and put them everywhere at a very cost-effective rate. So what we care about solutions like that. We're excited about it, but what we need to focus on is changing lives in the millions and tens of millions, not in 40 people at a time. That doesn't mean that that isn't important. That doesn't mean that that work shouldn't be done. But if we want to partner with you, we want to think about big scale, because that's what we have the opportunity and the need to. The last is that we believe that we all need to be voracious learners. I said over breakfast this morning that one of the titles I have at USAID is the Queen of Failure, because failure is actually a good word. It is part of the discovery process. It is part of the development process. And we need to be honest about that, and we need to be open about that, and we need to iterate again and again and again. So this is a fabulous idea. It doesn't scale the way it is. But here's another idea that we think is about what we're doing to scale. And that is the Development Innovation Ventures, which is it's a knockoff on a venture capital model that we've developed at USAID. It's doing stage financing. So we look at proof of concept, $100,000, small amount. Tell us what you want to do. Tell us what your friends and entrepreneurs want to do. It can be not-for-profit, it can be for-profit, it can be here, it can be around the world, that is really going to drive a development outcome. At stage 2, we want to see that you have evidence and that we can create scale. That's up to $1 million. Stage 3 is $6 to $15 million, which is then we want to see it scaled throughout the country and in other parts of the world. Here's how we define scale. We say, okay, well, what is scale? We know it isn't 40, and we know it's not $1 billion. So where does it? And I'll tell you how we came at it. In microfinance, it took about 30 years to get to 75 million. And so we said, okay, that's actually a good marker for us. Only we want to do it in 10 years rather than in 30 years. So in this program, we're looking even at the proof of concept stage at, can you do something? Can you come up with an idea that has the potential to scale to 75 million people around the world? We also believe that there's disruptive technologies. I hear that the guy who founded M-Pesa, Nick Hughes, is in the audience today. I'd say hats off to you. This is an amazing concept. I believe that and our goal at AID is to see that mobile money and that functionality goes on every phone handset in the world. And we think that that will be an incredibly empowering development outcome as a result. So we want to just not look at how do we do a vaccine, but how do we do those underlying infrastructures. As I said, we're in 79 countries. We believe that you and your people that you work with are a tremendous source of innovation, and we would love the opportunity to work with you. We know, as you do, that the path forward is not always clear, that you have to navigate, that we together have to navigate through a forest that has trees of corruption, inefficiency, and too little infrastructure. So we know that is part of it. But as Winston Churchill said to us, success is not final, failure is not fatal, and it's the courage that continues. So it is my deep, deep honor and privilege to have begun this conversation with you today and to thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you do. Thank you.